This event is the first of many events that are being organized by the MENA-UHPH, and I invite you to follow and stay tuned for our upcoming events throughout the coming months. And many of you have heard about the MENA-UHPH at the MENA Housing Forum, which was held in November 2022 when it was first launched. And I'm actually very pleased to see today a number of familiar faces from the forum, so it's great to see you all again. And today's discussion will focus on the very understudied topic of using land-based financing and land value capture instruments in informal settlements as a way to provide governments with much needed sources of revenue from which to fund upgrading projects. And for those who may not be aware of what land value capture is, it is a set of legislative, financial, and planning instruments that enable governments and communities to recover land value increases and then reinvest them into neighborhoods or other projects. And these land value increases, of course, are resulting from public investment. Land value capture is usually implemented in areas with high demand for development, resulting in higher land values. But in this discussion, we're tackling the following question, which is what are the potential opportunities and challenges for implementing land value capture in informal settlements. The focus on informal settlements is a core part of Habitat for Humanity's mandate, and it is in line with our recently launched 5-year global campaign called Home Equals. And I'm going to drop the link to this global campaign in the chat if anyone would like to explore and learn about it further. Just before I conclude, the event was inspired by and is a follow-up to the City Debates 2023. The City Debates is a conference that is organized by the Beirut Urban Lab, the American University in Beirut, and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. So before we dive into the discussion, I want to welcome first Abir Zatari from the Beirut Urban Lab, who's going to provide us with a brief recap of the City Debates. The City Debates 2023 was on the topic of land value capture. So she's going to give us a bit of a summary of that and some of the key takeaways in regards to land value capture. Abir, over to you.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you, everyone. Hello, everybody. I'm gonna try to share my screen. I think it's disabled.
It should be enabled.
Still not able to share.
Okay, can you try now?
Okay, it works.
Okay, great.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so hello one more time, and thank you for inviting me to this session. It's really exciting to see that the conversation on land value capture is being pushed further and picked up from City Debates. Again, my name is Abir Zatari. I'm a research coordinator at the Beirut Urban Lab at the American University of Beirut. And I'm here to briefly reflect, as you have mentioned, on the most recent City Debates conference, which was titled Taming the Growth Machine, the Promises and Pitfalls of Land Value Capture, that was held last March and perhaps brush the surface a bit on the concept or the approach for land value capture before my colleagues intervene. I want to highlight first, as you also mentioned, that the conference was made possible through the collaboration of the Masters in Urban Planning Policy and Design programs at the American University of Beirut, the Beirut Urban Lab, and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in the US. So over the course of 3 days, more than 25 scholars and land experts gathered to think and explore possibilities of land value capture tools and ways in which they can introduce them in different contexts. They came to present cases of success, setbacks, potentials, imaginaries, and lessons that they have learned from more than 20 countries across various regions around the world. So these are the cases that the countries where cases on land value capture were presented. But to put things into perspective first, it's important to understand the broader context that laid the foundation for bringing the concept of land value capture as a central theme for city debates this year. So it's no mystery that we're living in a neoliberal urban world. So the dominant free market paradigm that we live under today coincides with severe penetration of capital into urban land, and thus an exponential increase in land prices. We have seen in many examples around the world that this has led to increased ownership of land by a wealthy few and an unobstructed extraction of capital from land by real estate developers and property owners, while the vast majority of city dwellers struggle with crumbling infrastructure and exorbitant housing prices. Worse, local and central state authorities are disempowered by prohibitive cost of land, which prevents them from intervening in cities to provide critical social and physical infrastructures and to upgrade housing, provide parks, and many more. So several of the conference speakers emphasized this critical aspect of the context where they were working in. This includes particularly Beirut, where we saw how financialization has actually led to residential buildings being used as assets, developers having strong connections to influential figures, and the rental market lacking transparency and affecting affordability. And in Chile, where Francisco Sabatini expounded on the conversion of urban housing into a global financial asset in Chile, and the need to link back to a comprehensive, inclusive policy that addresses this challenge. In that context, and given that authorities are unable to intervene or regulate real estate prices, local authorities need a mechanism to allow them to capture part of the profit that is generated by land price increases or by this wealthy monopolizing group. The profit they capture can then be reinvested to improve living conditions and economic conditions in cities and make them more sustainable and viable, or what we term as land value capture. So how does it work? Land value capture refers to the process through which some of the increases in the property values that emerge from public investment are captured through taxes or other tools by the public authorities and reinvested in financing infrastructural projects such as parks, roads, schools, affordable housing, and more, which will then ultimately improve the quality of living and improve in the neighborhood, improve connectivity, and improve air quality and public spaces. These improvements, because all of us, I think, would love to live in viable neighborhoods and with good infrastructure. So these improvements in economic and social life would then make the neighborhood by itself more attractive, and then will cause an uplift or an increase in the property values that can again be captured and reinvested in other areas of improvement. So this will secure a continuous, so this is the theoretical framework of the concept. It will secure a continuous virtuous cycle in which a sustainable flow of money that emerges from land value increases is reinvested in urban improvement projects. So the common sense and simplicity of the concept of land value capture made land value capture actually an exceedingly attractive tool, and pushing many countries and cities to embrace this approach as they address different urban challenges that they encounter today. However, we need to note that, as highlighted in the conference, the success of the tool was not uniform across all contexts, as it demonstrated greater success in certain countries compared to others. I will introduce a selection of cases that were presented during the conference where the tool was effectively enhanced, has effectively enhanced cities' revenues or facilitated the financing and advancement of projects with significant public benefits. So one example is the Jordanian case as presented by Astrid Haas, who's here with us today. Just a recap of what she presented and her involvement in assessing the performance of land value capture in the Greater Amman municipality. She narrates how land value capture tools, mainly betterment and development levies in Jordan, has actually helped generate more than 60% of the municipal revenues in 2018. So with urban growth and the increasing need of infrastructure, the tool tremendously helped municipalities finance infrastructural projects. What is interesting about this case, or the performance of this tool in particular in Jordan, is that it was actually implemented through an alternative compensation practice that was not explicitly mentioned in the law. So there was a reversal in the interpretation of certain articles on compensation that compensate for the drop, so for the decrease in property values that were used by the city of Amman to charge compensation fees for rezoning or additional development rights or whatever would increase the value of the property, and consequently use them to finance infrastructure. Because of how logical it was, I think, this approach was endorsed and accepted to a great extent by property owners and became a significant source of revenue. Another case, I saw that we also have Claudia here. So another case is the South African case, which is another interesting case presented during the conference by Claudia Hetzerot, who showed how land value capture was used to intervene into exclusionary urban land markets of South Africa. So to do so, the Development Action Group, which is a nonprofit organization, collaborated with the City Support Program, a national government initiative, and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy to implement a capacity building program for local government officials in South Africa and push for the implementation of land value capture strategies. So after a long iterative process of dialogues and conversations and capacity building, they were able to push the city to include inclusionary housing program in their in the municipality that would allow low-income residents to access affordable housing in high-end markets or high-income neighborhoods in the city of Cape Town. So how did they do that? They did that by granting some of the high-end market zones with additional development rights, so they would allow them to build more than what is decreed on the condition that part of the housing stock would then be used for affordable housing. Conference participants also pushed further to introduce new possibilities that can be used to deploy land value capture tools in ways that can help cities become future-proof against the threats of climate change. So by capturing value from climate-resilient zones or zones that are less susceptible to climate disasters, governments were able or would ultimately proactively invest in climate-resilient infrastructures that might help mitigate the effects of climate change in disaster-prone zones and thus limit climate-induced migration patterns resulting from floodplains, drought, and others. I honestly have to say that we have seen these cases mainly in Europe, and these studies were such as Greece, the UK, and France, who might have more leverage to think beyond the basic urban issues that we live under today. Okay, so with that said, speakers highlighted some considerations and warned of factors that can impede the implementation of land value capture. So for the sake of time, I will only highlight 4 challenges that were mentioned during the conference. First, we need to have a level of confidence about the value of land if we are to tax increases in land value in the first place. So in a context where real estate markets are opaque and data is scarce, such as in many African countries and Arab countries, such as Lebanon, for example, it is difficult to determine land values and consequently to point to factors or interventions that actually influence the value of land and how it should be taxed. Another issue that we need to take into consideration is a need to embed land value capture mechanisms in the specific political economic contexts that shape land markets and the possibilities for land value capture mechanisms to be introduced. So as one example, which was also presented during the conference, where there's a context where there's lack of trust in the government, ring fencing offers a good solution to address this mistrust by rendering visible where the collected money is spent. So ring fencing refers to isolating a portion of the captured value increment and reinvesting it in clear and specific designated programs. So instead of the money going to the central government and then the central government would decide where the money would go, it would be ring fenced from the start, and the taxpayers would know that the money will be paid for this specific project or a park or a housing program. This practice would ensure that the utilization of captured land value is visible and clearly tied to an allocated program. So according to the context, urban planners would determine what kind of tool can be used, if it's tax or if it is related to special assessments or land readjustment. So third, land value capture is premised on the assumption that there's an inability of public agencies to intervene or control land prices. So we are taking for granted that land prices rise and authorities cannot do anything about it. This is dangerous, and this danger was presented during the conference second keynote by Professor Rachel Weber, that public agencies find it appealing or desirable for land prices to increase, and they would come in eventually as speculators since they would benefit from the land price increases. We have seen this in Lebanon, where municipal revenues came essentially from building permits, and we have found that urban municipalities are actually encouraging building activity excessively at the expense of any environmental or social considerations because they needed the revenues from the building permits. So fourth and last, and to bring it back to this event's context, land value capture and informal settlements require us to think beyond land value capture tools of what additional measures or tools should be introduced to make sure that the social end of public interventions in informal settlements are protected. So if land prices increase, based on experiences from Latin America and Egypt, as presented by Dina in the conference, show that in many low-income residents are actually end up being displaced. We should therefore make sure that limits are placed on market expansion in these neighborhoods with tools such as zones for special social interest, whereby land value capture is collected from surrounding areas and then invested in the informal areas to protect its residents for social ends. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shabir, for that very informative recap. And if anybody would like to dig further into the City Debates 2023, you can check out their website, which has the full agenda of the conference, as well as the recordings of all the sessions. And I've just dropped the link into the chat, so you can check it out further if you'd like. And now I would like to introduce our discussant for today's panel, who is Astrid Haas. And Astrid is an independent urban economist who works across research and practice. She's worked extensively with city governments across Africa and Asia in diverse roles. She is currently also an extraordinary lecturer in the Department of Economics at the University of Pretoria and a fellow at the Infrastructure Institute at the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. She holds an MSc in Public Financial Management from the School of Oriental and African Studies and an MA in International Economics and International Development from Johns Hopkins University. In 2016, she was nominated by the University of Cape Town as one of Africa's young leaders. And in 2020, she received Johns Hopkins University's Outstanding Recent Graduate Award for her work on urbanization. She has published widely on the topic of land value capture and municipal financing. And for more information about her work and publications, please check out her website, which is www.astridmhaas.com, and I'll also drop it into the chat. And without further ado, Astrid, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dina, for the invitation. Abir, that was an amazing summary of an incredibly rich conference. I encourage everyone to go check out the presentations on the website. I think it was one of the best conferences I've been to on land value capture. I learned a lot about different practices around the world, both the challenges, but also importantly, the opportunities. And I think that's what we're here to discuss today. What are the opportunities that land value capture provides? And this is an important question, particularly as we're talking about in some cities, over 60% of people living in informal settlements in situations that we cannot deem adequate, that we wouldn't want to live in, that we wouldn't want our children and future generations to live in. But if we don't resolve this problem of increasing the supply of affordable housing, given the rates of urbanization of many contexts in the world, we're not going to be able to unlock this problem. Myself, Dina, Abir, and I think many others on this call, on this meeting, would agree. I think that land value capture provides an incredible opportunity to both capture the public value that is created when we think about upgrading informal settlements and providing affordable housing. If we have the instruments in place, and importantly, as Abir mentioned, if then the benefits are redistributed. To help discuss this today, I couldn't think of a better panel that as well reflects sort of moving from the city debates, reflect the sort of diverse viewpoints from different parts of the world. I will introduce each of the speakers before they speak. So I'm going to start with Professor Nico Talavita, a Professor Emeritus at the Graduate Program in City Planning at San Diego State University. So it must be actually very early in the morning for you. So good morning, Professor. Professor Kavita has published widely on this question of affordable housing and land value capture, land use planning policies and comparative planning. He's the co-author of a 2010 book on inclusionary housing and an international perspective. And he's written a white paper on the subject of land value capture, public benefit zoning, and public value capture for the American Planning Association. In 2016, he was the recipient of the Marion Gittell Activist Scholar Award for Urban Affairs, for the Urban Affairs Association. So I'm going to, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative and go with first name. So Nico, I hope that's okay. I really look forward to hearing you speak about the US experience, which has come relatively far in being able to use land value capture policies, but really drawing from that and what lessons there are for other places in the world that are sort of still trying to unlock that potential. I'm going to keep to time, so I will send you a small nudge as a private chat first when you're sort of 5 minutes away. So please forgive me, but we have a very dense panel and a great audience here, so I want to leave time for questions. For those in the discussion room, please post your questions in the chat. We will have time to get to those later, but I know sometimes you have a question that comes up, so make sure you note it down, and I'll make sure that we can come back to it later. So Nico, the floor is yours.
Yes, let's see if I can get to my presentation. Dina, I send you the presentation. The screen sharing, but
yes,
I don't.
You sent it to me. I can. Would you like me to share it for you? If you'd like me to.
Yes, good.
Okay, sure. And just let me know when you need me to switch to the next slide. I'll share it now.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I've been working on land value capture for decades. And in the United States, as it has been mentioned, it's been rough going because of the particular political and economic structure of the country and the tremendous ideological support of property rights. But things are changing, and they're changing rather quickly, also because of the housing crisis in large part due to increase in land values of the land under the homes of many homeowners, but also of land for the entire cities. So I will be looking at the U.S. case first in terms of land value capture through planning mechanisms, and then by looking at a particular mechanism called tax increment financing.
Professor, can I just interrupt you for a minute? You'll have to resend the file to me because it's corrupt and it won't download. So if you can resend it, that would be great.
Well, in order to resend it, let me see here. Why can't I?
Can I just say, we can actually see your screen. So if you open the presentation, we should hopefully be able to see it on your screen.
Okay. There
Yes,
it is.
we can see we can see it. Yes. So we could just move forward from there.
Okay, good. So I'm going to start, second slide, please. I'm going to start with a little history.
Sorry, you have to change the slides now on your side because it's your screen that's being shared.
But it's not. Okay, let's try this.
Isn't it? There we go.
Okay, where does the idea of land value capture come from? It comes from two sources, one in England or Great Britain and one from the United States. In England, the classical economists of the late 19th century, such as Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, looked at increasing land value as unearned increments. In other words, the increment land values were not due to any activity of the landowner, but they were due to the growth of the city and activities of the public sector. In the United States, Henry George wrote a famous book, internationally famous, that which was about capturing land values through what he called the single tax. And he had worldwide success. When I came to San Diego 25 years ago, there was still Henry George chapter in the city of San Diego. I wrote a paper about the influence of Henry George in Italy on land value capture. Implementation of the land value taxation has been very tortured in England. It started in 1909, and when the values increase in England, they talk about betterment values, that the land has been bettered by the activities of government. And so there were attempts which were made, such as nationalizing the development rights in 1947, but that also was a rough going because it would be implemented by Labour government and then cut down by the conservative governments. Finally, in 1990, with the Section 106 of the Town and Country Planning Act, developers were required by locality to provide affordable housing and other benefits under agreements with the local authority. So that is what I will start with. My first part of the presentation is with do with capturing land value through land use planning. So the principle, I think, is very known for all of you, and the value can be increased through the construction of infrastructure and public facilities, and the mechanism which you utilize is special assessment financing. And there are examples in the US and especially in California that show how special tax increment financing has been implemented that have contributed to the financing of mass transit and mass transit stations. A good book that can be consulted to look at how land value capture can be utilized through different financing mechanisms, but especially special assessment. Okay, the main emphasis of the presentation of this first part is to do with plan changes, upzoning. How do we capture land values? By tying planning decisions, such as a preparation of a community plan, a specific plan, a general plan, to the provision of public and community benefits. Like what? Well, in Santa Barbara, which is in California, this planning tool was used to create affordable housing, social services, and creative arts, open space, and streetscapes, and biking conditions, and so on. How does it work? The price of the land is enhanced by planning decisions, but reduced by planning benefits. So what happens is that with planning changes, the value of the land will have increased with this much, but by forcing the landowner and hence the developer to provide public benefits, the increase in land value decreases or declines. So it is through the landowner, it's through the developer that land values is captured from the landowner. And there's a need for economic analysis. As the director of Vancouver, where one of the greatest examples of land value capture has been presented, there is a need for an economic analysis which shows how much the land values increase and what the value of the public benefits would be. And then the political body is the power to decide how much or how many the public benefits would be required from the developer. As I mentioned, probably the best example of land value capture in North America, at least, it was Vancouver, where the landowners were required to provide, it's basically around 80% of the value of the enhanced value of the land. And that was made possible as a result of a transparency on the part of the developer in terms of their analysis of costs and benefits of their development. Very good staff of the planning department, which became very expert in this kind of analysis and these kind of negotiations. The second way to recapture value through planning is based on the plans themselves, so that the requirements are based on how different lots on a piece of land obtain different kind of densities and heights, so that the fees are tailored to the amount of development rights that different parcels receive as a result of the plan. And can be very flexible based on the amount of entitlement that you receive. So in Santa Monica, for example, tier 1 would be a base density, and then based on how much additional density and heights you would receive, then you will pay additional fees. Okay, let me move now to urban regeneration in the US and talk about first about urban renewal, which is probably the most important, historically, the most important episode in the history of urban planning, because it had first deleterious consequences for millions of people, and because it changed the way planning is done in the United States. It started in 1949, and it was implemented in 1950s and 1960s. The federal government provided dollars to localities to acquire land in urban renewal areas, and they used the power of eminent domain expropriation to buy. The word utilized was blighted properties. They would clear the land, build the infrastructure, therefore improve the value of the land, but give the properties to private developers. So it was a top-down bureaucratic, centralized planning process, and it was based on the interest of growth coalitions, especially in downtown areas of the United States. Growth coalition formed by landowners, developers, and the politicians in the cities. And also the design principles were based on the Corbusier's towers in the park that we now understand that generally have are probably the worst in terms of creating a good living environment for the people living in them. So there was no community planning, and the results were that in the 1960s, there was a revolt against urban renewal. The approach was called the federal bulldozer, Negro removal, because the great majority of the people who were expropriated over their housing and moved were African Americans. And also it was called the blight that is right, because it was in many cases not the properties which were the most blighted that were expropriated, but the properties which were close to the downtown areas. And Herbert Gans, a famous urban sociologist of the time, wrote a book called The Urban Villages that looked at a community of Italian Americans in Boston, and it showed that it was functionally, socially, and economically very, very well, but it was very close to downtown Boston, and so they were expropriated and made to move. So the war and urban renewal called for, and these are things that probably will happen in any community that is being faced with the threat of expropriation, in many cases without any help. So the advocacy planning evolved as a result of urban renewal. Citizen participation, community planning evolved as a result of urban renewal, and also the federal government enacted legislation that made citizen participation absolutely essential in planning. So urban renewal was eliminated in the 1970s. How do you take care of blighted areas which still remain in American cities? So states passed redevelopment laws that improved on urban renewal by creating public participation mechanisms, providing relocation assistance, and mandating that a portion of new housing be affordable to low-income people, and that is the case in California. The financing mechanism was what is called tax increment financing. How does it work? Well, a particular area is declared a redevelopment area. A plan is prepared for the area. The taxes which were generated in that area are frozen, meaning that if an area is declared a development area in 1980, whatever taxes were going to the city, to the state, to the county, to the school board are left at that level, and they will continue to flow to those agencies. Okay, so they're frozen, but they remain at the same level. Bonds are sold to finance redevelopment activities for the redevelopment agency to buy the land, to create the public infrastructure, and so on. So obviously, the value of the property will increase if there is a demand. In the case of San Diego, as I will show, the redevelopment created a boom downtown. And the difference between the new tax revenue and the old taxes which have been thrown is the tax increment. So here you have in yellow, you have the base of taxes, which remain the same. And the difference between the new taxes and the old taxes is tax increment. The downtown San Diego invested through tax increment over a period of 30 years, $900 million. And that led to an investment on the part of the private sector of $7.5 billion. So downtown redevelopment in San Diego has been greatly successful. It took some time for the redevelopment agency to realize that the market now should and could build without any incentives. But now downtown is still booming, but without any incentives on the part of the redevelopment agency. And redevelopment agencies have been eliminated by the state about 10 years ago because there were abuses. Okay, to finish, it should be clear that revenues are not an increase in taxes, but a reallocation in taxes. The taxes are increasing as a result of the new development which is taking places, and the tax increment is utilized, so it's not an increase. It's important to understand the impact on other taxing jurisdictions. The point is, how much of the development in downtown San Diego would have occurred without urban redevelopment, which means that those tax agencies that I mentioned before would have received additional taxing revenues, but they did not for 30 years because their tax revenues were frozen. And there were concessions made by the redevelopment agency to increase their taxes given their success. Abuses. Since taxes were not going to other agencies, some cities have abused redevelopment. A city near San Diego, Coronado, which is an affluent city, declared the entire city a redevelopment area. And similar things have happened in other parts of California. That led, for other reasons as well, the Governor Brown, about 10 years ago, to eliminate redevelopment agencies. So what I've described doesn't exist anymore in the state of California. And now there's a search for other financing mechanisms. The last point I want to make is this is not real land value capture. This is a reallocation of taxes. Is not lowering the value of the land in the cases in which the value of land is increasing as a result of public activities. So we have to distinguish between land value capture when because of a demand or requirements for public benefits such as affordable housing or parks and so on, the increase in the value of the land will be lowered from tax or increment finance mechanisms where in reality, the landowners are going to benefit greatly from redevelopment because they're going to benefit from the tremendous amount of investments which have been made by the redevelopment agency. So it's a good mechanism. It was successful in San Diego, but if you're a purist and really you want to implement land value capture so that the landowners do not benefit from investment infrastructure or upzonings or plan changes, then the tax increment financing is not the mechanism for you. And for that, I'm finished, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Nico. That was fascinating. I do have a lot of questions because, obviously the US has, or some places in the US have used tax increment financing very successfully, but they also have access to a lot of data and a capacity to enforce where sort of a lot of the cities I work in don't. And I think there's some lessons that I captured from sort of your historical walkthrough in terms of how the US and how the UK has gone about it that I'll come back to when we have the discussion. But thank you very much for your presentation. We're going to go on to, so for anyone, please put any thoughts, questions in the chat now. We'll come back to the discussion afterwards. But I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our second speaker. Umberta Tempera is a land specialist at UN Habitat and the Global Land Tool Network, and based in UN Habitat's regional office for Arab states. And actually, Umberta, I just had the pleasure of actually working with one of your colleagues last week in Bahrain. So it's very nice to meet you as well. Umberta leads the agency's global portfolio on land and conflict and the regional work on housing, land and property rights. She has a background in urban planning and land management and over 18 years of experience in the humanitarian and development sectors. In her position, she coordinates the Arab land initiatives and provides advisory advisory support to UN Habitat and partners in North Africa, the Middle East, and more globally. And she's also published very widely on this subject, both in the UN and as part of University Press. So Amrita, over to you. Look forward to hearing your thoughts from the Arab region.
Thank you, Astrid. Please confirm that you can hear me.
Very well.
Yeah, great.
Yes.
Thanks for having me, and later also my colleague Heba Fakri, if time allows. And we are going to share some of your thoughts around the topic from now the perspective of the Arab region, and also looking at some of the emerged consideration in some of the conflict affected countries in the Arab region and nearby. So, you know, just initially a quick overview of the region. I know you're all very familiar, but 460 million people, very much urban region, 18%, about 18%, 18 million people living in slums. And also population very much concentrated on only a small portion of the land where, you know, a lot different land uses encroach on each other, particularly around the coastal areas or around the rivers. Very much a region very, very young, very mobile as well, you know, for different causes, conflict, but also climate change. There are over 62 million migrants and displaced people, very much water scarce, and desertification and land degradation is very prevalent. And lastly, the region is very much affected by, it's a fragile region overall. So this is the context where we look at the informal settlements and the need of upgrading them. As I see, is a big portion of the population living in these settlements. And what are the causes? Because indeed, if we need to intervene, it's important that we keep in mind how this phenomenon overall is constituted and what drives it. So there is obviously very much growth of the population in situ, where within the cities, and migration to the cities is extremely high. You know, conflict definitely are playing a huge factor, but we see that more and more, actually probably majority of people in the coming years are going to be driven to the cities in mass because of climate change, and also the impact that this has on the economics of rural sectors, you know, like agriculture or pastoralism. Definitely insufficient availability of formal service land for housing. Meaning that, you know, the new plots of land don't come into the formal market. And this again, you know, is very apparent in countries where, you know, the whole planning and lotization of land was stopped, like Libya, for example, or countries where, you know, conflict has affected the normal functionalities of the institutions, etc. Also, I mean, the urban mobility system is dysfunctional. We see, you know, that informality is really driven also when people need to spend a lot more time and spend a lot of money as well in paying for commute, and therefore they try to squeeze themselves as much as possible to the work opportunities. And this is a problem that affects the region very much. Public transportation is behind and drives definitely the growth of informal settlements. Overall, there is a lack of land tenure security as well. We don't have consolidated data on that, because also countries do not report on the SDG indicator on land tenure security. Also, there is not really, I mean, land and property registration is very low. So it's difficult and paper-based. So it's difficult for governments and countries to have data, but I would say less than 50% for sure of the region is registered. Some countries much lower than 10%. Some countries doing well. I think only a couple of one country I think is only fully registered, but some are making progress on that. But definitely, land terrace security is a gap. This affects the willingness and capacity of people basically to invest in their own housing. Also because accessing credit is really difficult. The banking system is quite exclusive, and these are all compounding factor. And also, since in many countries, the housing sector is disproportionately oriented towards high income users, commodification of land and housing for the national, but also for the international wealthy people, rather than really providing housing as a human right. And lastly, but not least, definitely a poorly regulated rental housing sector. Although some countries are trying to reform on that, but overall, this is a gap that affects the overall of affordability of housing. So as we can see, I mean, there is obviously, goes beyond land-based financing and land value capture, but we need to put the parameter into context, in the sense that if we are trying to address and prevent informal settlements, it's important that we also keep in mind what are the other options that we have to work on at the same time. So as at UN Habitat, we worked on land-based financing. You'll see there our one of our key publications. There are others as well, which kind of simplify the type of instruments with those that you see listed on my PowerPoint. I think the previous presentation was quite exhaustive in going to some of these instruments. Some of them are basically a one-time payment, and some are basically recurring taxes or fees, including land and property taxes, which are the one we work on the most. Yes, I don't think I'll go into detail on this because I want to focus particularly on one of them later on, which is exactly the land and property taxes. Yeah, so in a way, anyway, all these instruments, they increase the financial capacity of the public, which can be used and channeled to informal settlement upgrading. So in a way, definitely, we believe at UN Habitat that is a key element to support urban development in general, and informal settlements, upgrading and housing in particular, these instruments these instruments of land-based financing. The second aspect we look at is the introduction of recurrent taxes on lands and buildings as part of the process of regularizing informal settlements. And this has different aspects. That is definitely, look at the long-term sustainability and recovering part of the investment done, but also as a component that basically strengthens the land tenure security of the people living in these upgraded settlements, particularly in the absence of a functioning registration system. In many countries, including in the region, for example, people have been using in courts the tax return or the receipts from the payment of taxes to actually prove their land tenure claims to their house or land. But this exactly is a bit of a long-term recovery. The other one that is very much, we feel, is probably the one with the biggest potential in the region is in the context of land readjustment in settlements to be upgraded, where basically there is a partial reshaping of the plots that are, or the areas that are upgraded, and through this intervention, it's possible to identify some units or a portion of land that can be sold commercially and therefore, recover part of the cost of the intervention. If we look at the positive impact on land-based financing on settlements upgrading and its people, there are different aspects. One definitely is the increased revenues for the authorities, which bring out the best of its benefit if they are used transparently, including for settlements upgrading. Because the transparency is a key element that at times we see is really critical and missing. They can also, this instrument be put in place to promote compact urban development and control low density urban sprawl, which is a very big issue in the region, and not only in the region, but the difficulties that municipalities have in controlling the sprawl of urbanization in the surrounding areas, which have environmental impacts and also a significant factor in the cost of servicing this area. So overall, we look at some of these benefits are really the benefits of the sustainability of the cities as a whole. Reduce vacant land and properties, and therefore, forcing the owners, but also the authorities to make full use of the properties that are already in serviced areas, including to increase the housing offer. Number 4, reducing the prices of urban land. This is a very key issue, big issue globally again, but in the region as well. And one of the key drivers, according to our analysis of this uncontrolled increase of prices, is indeed the lack of sufficient taxation over land. And land taxation is a key factor to control the urban prices, because it reduces it's counterintuitive, and I know you're all much more expert than I probably on this aspect, but it kind of unfairly provides attracts investment on land, more for speculation rather than other type of investment that could be more productive, and therefore large acquisition of land as an investment or a speculation initiative rather than put land to use. And lastly, as said, of course, to the provision of land tenure security, meaning proving the ownership in cases where the land registration system, land or property registration system is not reaching everywhere. Now, of course, some of the challenges, I think when I was hearing professors speaking before me, I was thinking on how that would be applicable or not to the Arab region, and there are many differences. Number one, the functioning. For most of this mechanism to work, or all, I would say, land-based financing mechanism, we need a functioning land administration and a functioning land registration system. And the region doesn't have that, except, as I said, one country and plus maybe 2-3 other countries, 4 other countries making advances on that. This is a big gap. Paper-based land administration, even properties that are registered are outdated, etc. Secondly, transparency. We see also in the cases previously presented how the public had access to the information and was able to interact and respond or react to some of the decisions taken. This is not the case in the region. Also, land ownership is opaque, and also land use and use of the fund is not as transparent as probably in other contexts. Of course, the revenue collection itself needs to be established, and this is mainly really the process of collecting the taxes. We see that in many countries we worked on as UN Habitat, collecting the revenues, it's sometimes more expensive than the revenues collected. So there is an issue of processes there. A bigger challenge is the political will. Globally, we know that the rich pays the least in terms of land property tax. That's not an exception in this region, and that's really affecting the willingness in many contexts to actually make a change in this. And we saw that in some of the cases we work on directly. Also, you know, as I was hinting before, a lot of capital, big capitals, money laundry, speculation money goes into the land sector. And that's obviously difficult then to regulate. And the land and property valuation methodologies are very weak. Very weak also because many of these methodologies are looking exclusively at the registered land, where we see that actually the large majority of land is not registered, and therefore the question of how we adapt the methodologies to have an accurate valuation of land which is not registered is missing. Now, just briefly, I want to touch upon the issues conflict. We see that property
Umberto,
tax.
One more
yes,
minute. Sorry.
Yes, we saw that working in Somalia to various extent and Afghanistan as well. You'll see some of the charts here, but I would like to conclude with some of the lessons on this. So it's possible to introduce these elements also in conflicts or fragile contexts, because it still works for strengthening land tenure securities and increasing revenues. But we don't see a translation necessarily into better service delivery. Also, many intervention we do as inhabited in this type of context is that with the understanding that this will strengthen the social pact, or, you know, governance dividend, but we realize that this is a concept that is very much tailored on Western models and doesn't really apply in contexts where that are not stable, or even less in authoritarian contexts. Enforcing taxation is difficult. So at the end, we see that actually more pressure is exerted on the poor or those without negotiating power. And at the end, this balancing even more the dynamics there. And probably it would be easier to tax direct services provided at the land. Yeah, and definitely, I mean, the difficulties are also to make an intervention sustainable and predictable, and then translate it into policy that can really make it impact at the national scale. So with that, I think for the moment, I would leave it here. I leave with this slide where we show the publications that we have as the Inhabited on the topic, and back to you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Umberta. And I really appreciate the overview you've given us, and also sort of the responses you gave in terms of what can you do when it's like a less than perfect administrative context for this. And I would like to come back to some of that. I also know that your colleague Heba has some case studies, and perhaps we can take those in the sort of discussion section. But before I do that, let me just pass over to our final speaker. So our final speaker, Samra Abdelkalek, is a local development specialist at the World Bank in Egypt. And she has a variety of work experiences in different international organizations, both on urban development more generally and fiscal decentralization specifically. She's been working with different stakeholders in enhancing local own source revenue and land-based financing. And she holds an MA in international relations from Sciences Po, Bordeaux in France. So Samar, let me hand over to you. And I'm very excited to learn from you as well, as I'm actually also doing some work on land value capture in the Egyptian context. So I'll have some questions around that as well. So please, over to you, Samar.
Thank you so much, and I'm really glad that I'm here to participate with you in this rich discussion. And so let me start very quickly to gain time. Let me share my screen. Okay. So Let me start very quickly on the land-based financing instruments as building on Amreta's presentation, actually, and I see that she has mentioned the instruments very quickly. So let me say that some of them are like on property registration, for example. It's one of the oldest land-based revenue sources in the recurring tax on land and often immovable structures on the land. And it is payable at regular repeating intervals, but it really needs many policy issues to be taken into consideration and to be articulated in law and formal policy statements. Also very administrative issues to be taken into consideration, like improving the coverage and improving the accuracy and timeline of property valuation and the billing and collection procedures. Very quickly, let me take you on the other instrument that is there that we have is the betterment levy or the betterment charge. It is levied in cases where public investments benefit particular landowners much more than the community as a whole. So one day you find in front of your house a new bridge or a new road that has been established. So you will have to pay a fee or a levy based on this new improvement that you have benefited particularly from it, other than other land areas or owners. So this betterment charge for cost recovery are generally one-time charge assessed in connection with specific government infrastructure that you have benefited from. And it is important to recognize that similar land-based finance instruments are called different names in different countries. But at the end, it means the same. It is when you have this infrastructure that happened, you benefit from it. So you will have to pay like a small percentage or a share from the increment value of your property due to this new infrastructure that happened. So third, we have the developer exaction. So it is actually required contribution by the developer to cover the cost of additional public infrastructure and service. So let's say one day you have this mall that opened, and due to this new mall or this new building that happened to be there, the citizens will come often, will use more the street, more the road, so we'll have to do more maintenance. And so this pressure on the road due to this new mall that has opened, you as a developer has to pay a share to help in the infrastructure and the maintenance of road, etc. So the developers must respect the requirement that specific permission from the appropriate government entity is required before beginning the construction. So let's say that developer exaction could assume any of the following forms. Maybe dedication of land for public use, for example, a requirement that a project reserve a certain percentage of land in a new development for public space. Maybe a construction of public improvements, for example, a requirement that a developer construct a public road to connect the proposed development with the existing public road network, or funding, perhaps in the form of a negotiated amount and tied to a broader policy goal, such as contribution toward the cost of a new public daycare or recreation center, and finally, utility connection fees. The fourth instrument that we can talk about is the sale of development rights. Because owning a land doesn't automatically include the right to develop the land any way the landowner decides. So owning a land doesn't mean that you can develop it whenever you want, whatever you want. Sometimes you have to buy the right to develop it from the government. The proceeds from the sale of development rights are used by governments to invest in social housing and other urban amenities, generally in the same geographic area. To be successful in selling additional development rights, there must be market demand, legal framework allowing for the sale of development rights, effective control of existing development rights, and a governing authority with the technical and administrative capacity to effectively initiate and monitor this sale of development rights. So the fifth instrument that we can talk about is the transfer tax. It's levied at the time where a registered title of a property tax is transferred from one party to another. And there must be an up-to-date formal land registration system. So again, we are building on what Amreta has just mentioned, that in the idea of property registration is very important to benefit or leverage the instrument of land-based financing. So this one is transfer tax is very related to property registration. So whenever we have a buyer and a seller and this selling operation goes on, they must pay the transfer tax. The Land Registration Administration must be capable of receiving and processing required registration documentation, including verification of authenticity and accuracy, and levying and collecting the appropriate tax. Going very quickly to the instrument number 6 that we have is the land sales. The sale of public lands converts one type of public asset, the land, into another, cash, through the sale of the land to the private sector. This is a very important actually thing, because in many cases, and especially in Egypt, for example, it's a very important source of revenue for local government or for the cities. They usually or very quickly sell the land without taking into consideration if the land is really, this is the best way to use it, to sell it to the private sector. So it's a very important asset, actually, the land, and we shouldn't be easily selling it without doing our studies to either keep it for public service or for a specific infrastructure needed. So that's why land should be sold through a transparent process. And in order to do it, we need to ensure that full market value is obtained. So the requirements to sell public land are: the government must have land that is considered to be no longer needed for public purposes. This is an important judgment with very long-term consequences, actually. And there must be market for the land, capturing the real full market value. And finally, we have the 7th instrument is leasing public land. So through multi-year leasing agreements for either annual or one-time revenue, or maybe both, creates a leasehold interest that allows private entities to develop the land and potentially sell the lease in a secondary market. Government entities seeking to lease the land must have available land and must have the administrative capacity, again, to regulate such a leasehold system. So we have seen that many of these land-based finance are just tax-based or fee-based or incentive-based. Some of them are one-time or recurring. So we have different types of the land-based finance. But let's take this to the Egyptian context and see how the Egyptian experience has been with the land-based financing instruments. So actually, since 2020, I've been involved in many discussions with the local government, trying to enhance their own source revenues, because this is a big issue in Egypt, and it's not very well handled, actually. So the discussions will actually to try to enhance all source revenues in general, but the main challenges that were identified during the discussions tackled many of the land-based finance instruments that we have just presented. So let's talk about the betterment levy, for example. The betterment levy is applied as the law number 222 for the year 1955. So it's very outdated, actually. Maybe by the time it was issued, it was great. It was very well formulated. Back then in Egypt, we had like major public infrastructure projects. So it was really good by then, but now it's very outdated, and it never happened that we have any reform to this law to capture the whole progress and the recent changes that happened into the community and Egypt as well. And also the steps for collection and calculation are not clear for all city council staff to collect during the issuance of building permits, for example. So when we started the discussion with the city council staff members, they were not aware of how to collect this betterment levy, or the steps to collect it, or the calculation methodology as well. So this lack of awareness has made that the betterment levy is actually very rarely applied. But it's also related to the second challenge that was identified, is the lack of incentive for the local government to collect such fees or betterment levy, because actually it's locally collected, but directly transferred to the central treasury. So they don't benefit from the collected revenue. And so they also rely very much on the central transfers to cover the gap in their budget. So they don't need actually to collect any revenues locally. But let's speak about the third challenge identified during the discussions. It was related to vacant land tax. Vacant land tax was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1993 on the basis that the land doesn't generate income in order to impose a continuous tax of 2% and increasing this value by 7% each year. So it is not currently collected by local government, and no one has started the discussion to try to resolve the problem or the constitutional problem related to this tax. This takes us to another land tax, is the agriculture land tax that was frozen in 2017. And until now, the local government doesn't actually collect it. It wasn't collected, or it was frozen because the government was trying to encourage citizens to keep it as agriculture, to keep the activity going on. And a 14% tax is a high percentage, actually. So in return, based on estimates of local committees appointed by the relevant governor, so the idea of calculation of the tax and how it is paid actually is not very well encouraging for people to pay it. For the other challenges identified, I can speak about the special exactions that are imposed on developers. This is actually not implemented in Egypt, and however, due to the increased load on road and utilities networks in the area due to the new construction, nor are there exactions imposed due to infrastructure improvements in the surrounding areas. So it's not actually, we don't benefit from this idea of developer exactions. However, we have many of, we can say, developments that happen and many increased load on roads used to reach this new development project that happens, but actually we don't benefit from this due to the lack of any law mentioning the regulations to implement it. This actually, in addition to unclarity of the regulations governing rezoning and changes in the building heights, as it appears that building height levy has not been attempted by governorates, even though the practice of adding unlicensed floor to building is extremely widespread in Egyptian cities. So we have this big demand from Egyptian citizens to add extra floor to their buildings and to go higher and higher, but as we call it, air rights sometimes is not actually implemented in Egypt. Talking about the property tax now, the property tax has been administered by the central government. It is one, from the international experience, property tax is one of the main land-based finance actually instruments. However, in Egypt, it faces many problems, such as the majority of properties in Egypt are not recorded or are not registered, and that over 90% of residential property not liable for the property tax because it actually set at 2 million Egyptian pounds, and the majority of residential properties are not reaching this high threshold. And finally, we have this limited capacity at the local level regarding the application of instruments aimed at the disposal or sale or leasing of public land. So this lack of capacity is actually not only for leasing land, but for all the instruments that we have been talking about. So this takes us to this question: what can be done to enhance land-based financing in Egypt? These challenges that has been identified throughout the discussions with local government has made us think of the solutions in three categories. First is fixing the legal framework. So actually, let's say that many challenges are related to problems in the legal framework, such as the outdated law of betterment levy, the unclarity of the application of development exactions and building heights. So we need a holistic approach to be provided through the consolidation of legislation that applies to the different tools, in addition to developing tools which are complementary to one another. Maybe in the Egyptian context is not the best things to apply a betterment levy, and it is more suitable to apply development exactions, for example. So we need to think of this holistic approach that can be regulating better land-based finance in Egypt. Also, the second category where the solution fall on is creating incentives. The local government employees don't have an incentive to collect the different revenues, mainly because they don't benefit from collecting such revenues. Generous central transfers weaken the incentive for local government to collect revenues. Also, local government need to face incentives to adopt the new or reform taxes. From the citizen side, citizens and businesses must learn to pay new taxes. This is very weak in Egypt. The citizens don't have actually any incentive to pay the taxes or fees or the user charges So, which they will resist doing unless they broadly perceive that local government are being responsive and treating them fairly and providing services and infrastructure delivery as their need. Third is enhancing the administrative capacity. The administrative capacity at the local level should be enhanced to enable the staff in the local administrative units to evaluate the different tools, to choose the best and the most suitable instrument for the different cases, actually. So now this is going to the third part of my presentation, actually, is to talk about planning city expansion and applying land-based finance in Egypt, a case study. So
Sama, sorry,
yeah.
you're actually out of time. So I wonder whether you could just very quickly go through this last piece,
Sure.
And then we can always come back to it with questions.
1 minute, exactly. So existing cities have absorbed like 95% of the population increase through informal urban expansion that lack access to quality service, infrastructure, and built environment. I'm talking here about a case study that happened in Qalubayah Governorate in Banha City, where it was an expansion area lacking infrastructure, lacking services. And in Egypt, what we do to city expansion areas, that we have a strategic plan that has been published by the local government with the urban growth boundary. Whenever the urban growth boundary is published by the local government, the price of land just jumped 10 times than the current value. And so citizens or landowners don't wait for the second layer of planning, which is the detailed planning that should actually say where the roads are going to be, the infrastructure that will be provided. They just want to build very quickly their land. They don't want to wait. And actually, the gap between publishing the urban growth boundary and the detailed plan can take up to 5 or 10 years in Egypt. So they can't wait all this long to just build their land. So the main challenges detected during the process was the tremendous value. However, no land value capture policy instrument was actually implemented. Also, the fragmentation of land ownership. The detailed plan is no way to be implemented because there is a huge land ownership fragmentation, no registration of these lands, so we don't have a registry of the lands, and the lack of infrastructure. So piloting participatory land registration has actually benefited us with the idea of having a 33% deducted from the land for roads and public spaces, collection of betterment levy against the incremental increased value of the remaining private land. And this actually has been a very, or a good example to be maybe scaled up, but the problem is that land readjustment itself is not mentioned in the building law in Egypt. So we don't know how it can be scaled up or used. And actually, as it has been said before in the previous presentations, that it makes the city self-financing, it provides required infrastructure investment for road expansion and realignment. So just whenever you do this land readjustment, you have the space to have buildings, to sell the flats, and to rent the shop for commercial spaces, and take the money again to just provide or fund improvements in low-income areas. So just very quickly in Egypt, what needs to be done to have this land readjustment thing scaled up and to have better implementation of land-based finance, we can think of better legal framework and a clear version of land-based finance tool to be adopted instead of unpractical current betterment levy and extractions to convert agriculture to urban use. And finally, an annual property tax to be collected firmly nationwide. And thank you so much. And sorry if I've took more time than expected. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you, Samar, because I was actually going to come back to that question of land readjustment, because now it's been brought up sort of in Umbretta and in your presentation as a sort of land value capture tool that's underutilized, but with a lot of potential. And I think that's extremely interesting. I'm going to ask each of the speakers a question, and also we have a question from Heba Khalil in the chat as well. And if we have a bit more time, please do feel free to ask your questions as well. If we have a bit more time, we also have some more case studies from UN Habitat, also from Egypt, which is very interesting. But before we go there, Nico, are you still online? No, I don't see you. Okay, so I will hold off my question. Maybe he's reconnecting. In the meantime, Umberta, I want to come back to this point of land readjustment and sort of draw on what Sama has just presented about Egypt and using it in expansion areas. But you also mentioned it as a potential for upgrading informal settlements. And I wanted to, given that we're looking at sort of land-based financing instruments, particularly to help sort of support the growth of housing needs and support to sort of upgrading to more adequate housing, I wanted to ask your experience and where this has been done successfully and what the underlying factors were, particularly now with respect to housing or upgrading informal settlements, what the underlying factors were to make that happen. And Samar, you mentioned an interesting point that has come up for me sort of in the Egyptian context, but in other contexts in the Arab MENA region as well, which is to do with the social contract. Generally, governance in the region is very centralized. And so, as you mentioned, local governments don't have the incentive to collect tax. But at the same time, also local governments don't have a lot of authority to provide the requirement of infrastructure that obviously increases the value of the land and sort of sets off the cycle in terms of land value capture. And so I wanted to ask you sort of from your experience and sort of, with your recommendations about empowering local governments, how can this sort of feasibly be done in a situation where, I understand they have a lack of incentive to collect the tax, but they also don't necessarily provide a lot of the infrastructure. So what do you see as some sort of innovative mechanisms there? And then whilst I'm just on there, I just want to add Heba's questions. Thank you so much, Heba, for putting them in. Heba has a question for Samar, which is about the reconciliation fees that people are paid for formalizing their houses, and what is done about that. And there's a sort of follow-up questions about what happens when you're reassessing value. So Heba, do you want to add anything to that, to your questions? Sorry, I've just taken them from the chat, but maybe you have if you want to just unmute yourself and actually ask them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Astrid. Sorry, I was just away. I was just asking about thank you, Samar, of course, for your presentation, of course, Umberta. And a question was about we have like the reconciliation fees that the government put in order to formalize the houses. So whenever anyone has some sort of informal development or informal extensions, there were some fees to be paid in order to formalize that. So I would like to know your feedback on this process and how does this money goes back to the local municipalities and be reinvested in the area itself rather than going to the central government. Yeah, and of course, also for the redevelopment project, that's another question, is the redevelopment project. There is, I think, only one example, the very famous example in Cairo, the Maspero area, where the area was redeveloped. And to be able to do that, they had to reassess the value and also to consolidate properties. So there is a little bit of land readjustment that took place, but on another scale, and also how to capture this value and make even, like, for instance, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who was just adjacent to this, used to be slum, now a redevelopment area, has to pay a betterment fees. So I'd like to know your feedback about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Heba. And Nico, you've just rejoined us. I have a question for you too. So yes. As you all heard from Umberta and Samar's presentations, that the regions that we work in, we talk about the sort of far less than perfect circumstance to implement some of these instruments due to lack of land administration, both policies and in some cases the policies are there, but the administration, the ability to administrate the capacity isn't. But one thing that was interesting for me from your presentation was what you said happened in urban regeneration in the 1950s and 60s in the US. And this is sort of government using eminent domain and then, handing it over to private developers and that not working for the benefit of the people. But in the context, for example, that we're working in, let's say Egypt, or I work a lot in other African countries, the housing needs are so large that, and the government capacity so low to provide housing on such a scale that this is often what is done, right? So the government gives land to private developers ostensibly to build affordable housing, although there's such a lack of housing that affordable housing becomes middle-class housing. I wanted to just get your thoughts on, in cases where that needs to happen, where there is no capacity for the government to actually build lots and lots of housing, so where the private sector does have to come in, what can be put in place to prevent the sort of abuse of power that was experienced in the US in 1950s and 60s. So those are the few questions that I'm posing. I suggest that we go the other way around right now. So Samar, you first, then Umbretta, and then Nico will end with you.
So if I understand the question is what, not being an expert in the context that you work in, but I assume abuse of power exists everywhere. And so how do you deal with those? The response to the abuses of urban renewal, as I pointed out in the presentation, was for the give more power to communities involved. I would say that's the most important tool that it can be used to create a mechanism through which the communities that are invested with making decisions, or they're confronted with the possibility that their community are going to be affected by an urban renewal scheme, to become a part of the discussion. Of course, the different ways, the sociologists at the time of the 1960s created a ladder of citizen participation. So to talk about the communities participating in the process, affecting their communities, is not enough. It's very important to understand that communities can have a role of just coming to a meeting room and listening about what's going to happen to their community, all the way to different steps. The residents becoming part of the plan preparation for a particular community. So that you have to be very careful that when you talk about residents' participation, that it becomes clear what kind of participation will residents have. Also you need to have experts helping the communities. Communities are not very well versed in planning terms. I remember an experience of my own of about 30 years ago when I was working in a community, and I started talking using the planning jargon, and we were sitting around the table, and this woman looked at me after I finished, and she said, "I did not understand a word of what you said." And so it's very important for the community to become to learn about the planning processes and to have experts helping them. And advocacy planning, advocacy planning was one movement at the time as part of the 1960s, which had planners work with the community in advocating for the community when the plans were being prepared, to make sure that the community would receive their fair share.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's I think we would all very much agree to that, and empowering the community, but also empowering them to be able to ask the right questions by having the experts involved. Samar, over to you.
Also, that if a legislation is passed as part of the process, that legislation have also elements which mandate that the citizen participation. In other words, that is embedded legislation as well. That helps.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, no, I much agreed. Samar, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you so much, and thank you for the question, and for help as well. Do you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So yes, it's a very important topic, and as we have said during the presentation, that it's a common problem that everything goes to the central government, and whenever it goes to the central government, never comes back to local government. So it keeps at the hand of the central government to to use the money, to see where it's going to be. And the local government doesn't have much to say about where the money collected will be going to. So we have a problem of valuation, problem of reconciliation, and the most important thing is the participatory approach that is not very or not widely implemented to make sure that it always reflects the citizens' needs or the citizens' view. So I would say that it's a problem of somehow centralizing everything that is currently collected. And I'm not sure if I've got back to the idea, but simply that's what I would reflect on, that it's the problem of centralizing and keeping the say to the central government, while keeping a problem of calculation, problem of valuation, and problem of returning back the money. Let's say for expropriation, for example, it still faces a lot of problem and challenges to be applied in Egypt for the public interest, and or reconciliation. So it all fall under the idea of a better legal and regulatory framework to be implemented. And sorry, Astrid, I haven't catched all your questions, so I hope that I have replied to you.
No, but yeah, no, on the revenue side, but the local governments, as far as I understand, are not even responsible for much of the infrastructure side, right? So
Yes.
for doing the work that increases the value, so to speak.
Yes, it's the idea of empowering local administration. It actually needs to be the idea of subsidiarity, as we say, that it always the position to be for the nearest level of government near to the citizens. Currently, we have been working with the Ministry of Local Development on just having updated or newly developed programs of local development to just have an updated functional assignment and to make sure that the services and infrastructure provided by local government are under the mandate of the local government. So this is something new, something that have been piloted in 4 of the Upper Egypt local development, Upper Egypt governorates, and hopefully this will be scaled up and to have newly developed mandates for local government to have more responsibility of providing infrastructure and services at the local level. Thank you.
Great. And to Heba's question about the sorry, Heba, the case study you were talking about, the Maspero.
Yes,
Did you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, it's becoming as my first part of the answer, that it's always related to the idea of valuation, and if you're speaking about how this goes to the central level, so is the local government having a say on this? No, it
all part
actually,
of the same issue.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean it is a lack of it's very truly misaligned incentives at many levels, but it would be super interesting to see what the pilots in the 4 governorates that you mentioned show, and whether that can then be scaled up sort of through proof of concept further. But Umbretta, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Astrid, for the question. I mean, land readjustment is a very, very important tool in our understanding in general. And I actually just placed in the chat a link to a publication that we did as in Habitat on this tool, which is a variation. I mean, land readjustment exists really in basically most of the country, at least as a concept. It's called in different ways. In this publication, you'll see examples from Bhutan, Burkina Faso, India, Germany, Colombia. You mentioned it. It's a concept that started maybe more in developed economies, but now it became very clear. I mean, even more so probably in developing or lower income country, that you have basically, we are becoming many in the world. We are urbanizing, we are changing land use, we need to conserve our ecosystems. So the way people are spread on the land needs to evolve with the society. And there are basically two ways, is that either we expropriate or we readjust. And because nobody has the money governments do not have the money for expropriating, except, in specific cases, very, maybe urban, the only way forward is readjusting. So when we assessed, definitely what we need to do that to make sure that actually this process, which is very lengthy and cumbersome, becomes actually accessible and inclusive and actually works for the people and not only for the owners, are different elements. I mean, the first aspect is to clarify who has the right to what in that, in the area where we want to readjust. And this means looking not only at the owners, but also at the land users, at people who have been has stake on that particular portion of land, and also assess and value not only the ownership, but also what additional social value or even identity value, religious, spiritual value that particular piece of land has, to make sure that actually the process doesn't become a sort of a monetary equation only, but includes all the aspects of life. So definitely, again, coming back to the issue of valuation, which is a big gap. Then clearly there is need to develop legislations. We see also even some of the countries, I think including Egypt, looking at developing a legislation that suits that. But, we have countries having a sort of 100-page law legislation that describes in detail what are the terminology, and we see that some even the terminology in some of the contexts are still to be clarified further to be able to actually have an adapted concept that suits to the local context and is able to function there. And clearly, I mean, the fact that where are the responsibility lying, should be really decentralized. But the key probably aspect is, because as also Samar was mentioning, the issue is when something is declared, those that have better access to the information are able to capture the value or the advantages for themselves of that particular exercise. So the issue is at one point, manage the information in a way that is inclusive and understood by all. Try to also to have a process that doesn't stretches over too long, because the more the process stretches, the more variable come in, and nothing will never be able to control all the variable. But if we kind of manage to have something quite fast and clear, we will minimize the gray areas where the vulnerable ones are losing out the most. So the aspect, I think, when ASEAN Habitat, we look at the land readjustment practices and concepts, where we felt we had more to add was exactly this aspect of evening a little bit the playing ground for the different actors, particularly the communities, with the aspect of participation and inclusion. So that may be what I wanted to say, I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Let me just check the chat. Not at the moment. I think Heba, it would be great if you. Oh, sorry, Dina, please.
Hi, if nobody else from the audience has questions, I do have a couple of questions. Should we turn it to the audience first?
I think I'm monitoring. There's no hands at the moment, so please feel free to go ahead. And I think as people want to speak, they'll put it in the chat or raise their hand.
Sure. Okay. So thank you all for the incredibly interesting and informative presentations. My first question is to Umbretta. In implementing the land readjustment in informal settlements, particularly those on privately owned land, such as the case in Banha and generally peri-urban informal settlements around Greater Cairo and in other parts of Egypt, I'm wondering, are there mechanisms that can be put in place to ensure that not only owners benefit from the increase in land value, but also renters, as opposed to renters being forced to leave the area as the rents increase? And I have a second question for Samar. And Samar, in your presentation, you mentioned one of the instruments, which I believe was called developer obligations. Please correct me if I'm wrong. You mentioned that it's an instrument that allows governments to obligate developers to dedicate a portion of the land to public space or facilities. So I'm wondering, does this instrument also in the law allow for obligating developers to allocate land for low-income housing, similar to inclusionary housing instruments that we see elsewhere, or is this not really outlined in the law? Thank you.
Right, Ambretta, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea for capturing the rights of the land users, including the renters, when we start a land readjustment scheme is not really for them to capture the value increase of the land, but is for them not to lose out in terms of you know, when the scheme will be completed, and then, you know, people will be able to go back or in some of the units or in the readjustment or upgraded units. So the fact that, for example, if there is a preferential treatment and, you know, housing unit offered at, you know, reduced price to the former owners, that the renters could benefit from some of these facilitated rent. So basically that they don't come back, for example, in buying or renting the unit at market prices as they would those that come from the outside, that would basically come in the scheme with the idea of, you know, cross-subsidizing the intervention with their payment. So let's say there is a land readjustment, the people who were there before, whether they were owners or renters or squatters or users, they might get access to either owned unit or rented unit or leased unit with different type of leases at preferential rates, while others will be open for market to recover some of these investments. So the idea is that the former tenants would be in the first category. They will not really fall into, you know, into the second category. And there, I mean, and obviously there is a wide range of nuanced variations on what mechanisms are possible there. And I think, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, and my colleague Hiba can actually maybe come in a bit more clearly on that, even the housing schemes that are being put in place here in Cairo to rehouse people that are moved from informal settlements are, you know, the renters and the owners are both taken into consideration in provision of, you know, upgraded houses and in different locations as well. Thanks.
Heba, do you want to add to that before I come to Samar? Heba Fakri.
Just
Sorry.
sure. Yeah.
Sorry for it's. I think you mean Heba Fikri or Heba Khalil? Which one? Now we
I meant Heba Fakri because Ambretta just referred to her. So let me let Heba Fakri come in, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you, Dr. Heba. Yeah, but in this consideration, yet exactly as Ambretta said, it's different aspects. And back to Dr. Heba's question about Maspero case, especially, there is different level of informality in Egypt, the unsafe, the informal on the public land, the informal on private land, and the informal on owner's land. This is what makes different mechanisms more appropriate to each case. And the complexity of Maspero case is coming from having informal settlements on unowned land or private lands which is not owned to the government. That's what added a different level of complexity. And the informality not just in having or owning land, but also informality of the economic situation of the people make all the the mechanisms for development, betterment leave, and the taxation like failed for them to cover. For having this mechanisms on informal settlements on private land or the land readjustment on the peripheries in Egypt. Yes, by adding some slots or some units and the betterment of the area itself increase the value, but also add some opportunities for the people. So they would have better local economic development, which make them be able to maybe pay the rent, having more job opportunities that make the life more sustainable for them.
Thank you. Let me, before I come to Samar, sorry, I'm just going to ask Heba Khalil, you had your hand up. Was it related to this question as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Astrid, and thank you. I am really enjoying the discussion and all the inputs from all the speakers, and just the complexities of when we talk about land readjustment, specifically in the Egyptian case, and you have the layers of the owner, the land. Sometimes you have the landowner, and then the building owner could be someone else, and then the renter, and there is a secondary renter. And in one of the cases that we tried to do land adjustment quite some years ago, like 10 years ago, something like that, or more, even we had a problem that it's not about the government wants the renters to go out, it is the owners who want the renters to go out. So they could agree to land readjustment just to get the renters out. And that's also something that it's very difficult to maintain the inclusivity of the process and so forth. And in that specific case, there were so many people should be compensated, and at the end, nothing was done, because if you calculate all the value that should be put here, or the compensations or whatever, it became so much overloaded that at the end it was not feasible anymore. Even if you provide like a floor to area ratio quite high, that development is not feasible anymore. So that's I'm an advocate of land readjustment, definitely, but there are so many complexities that go along the process if you look into different contexts.
You're on mute. Were you still saying something, Heba?
No, I was just saying thank you.
Okay. Okay, wonderful. Samar, maybe you can sort of also. You had a question, but maybe you can also contribute to this very interesting discussion about the potential of land readjustment in the Egyptian context of trying to expand housing or upgrade informal settlements, and from your experience.
So thank you so much, and thank you for repeating actually the question. I got disconnected. So if we are talking about land readjustment right now, so as I was saying that the pilot that was actually implemented, or the experience, has been very rich and let us know about many challenges that are happening. It takes a lot of time to implement land readjustment actually, because you have it is necessary to do it through a participatory approach. So it's very important to include landowners in the process, because to hear from them, and actually raising again the problem of property registration, of land registration, that you don't have any titles, or you don't have any updated titles. You are relying on the landowners to let you know what are their title deeds, or to just share with you the ownership of the land. So to take it one by time, and to see the history of the land piece or the land parcel, and to make sure of the ownership of the land. I'm here also speaking about the land that doesn't have buildings, as per the previous discussion, that when you have buildings on the land, it becomes more and more complicated as well, because sometimes you are not fast enough as the landowners that start to build very quickly without having a plan for the land, and so it makes it more and more difficult to do the land readjustment. So I would say that it is very necessary, as many other aspects, to have a legal framework for this, to start having it in a more regulatory form that mentioned the steps, the needed other things that will be related to this land readjustment planning methodology. So it's very important, and it's very related to the property registration system that must be in place, which is on a very high level. Yes, I see that Hiba is writing in this chat. Sorry. Actually, Hiba, you're talking about the developer. Actually, the developer exactions is not really implemented. The Egyptian law or the Egyptian government don't actually obligate any developers to pay anything or to dedicate any part of the land to low-income housing in Egypt is not yet implemented. It's actually proposed as one of the tools implemented nationwide or in other experience or international experience. But currently, if you do that, you will be doing it by, you know, the relationship between a city council or the local government with a specific developer saying, okay, if you do that, you will, for example, develop an urban space or an urban area beside your developed area. But actually, no, the Egyptian context doesn't obligate any developer to dedicate any part for low-income housing or anything like that, or at least not by a formal regulatory or legal framework. It would be by maybe.
I think, Summer, your connection is cutting, but I think the gem. Oh, sorry, Summer, we can't hear you, but I think the response was it's not actually formalized in the legal framework.
Yes.
Brett, I see you have your hand up, but I just wanted to get Nico's thoughts on whether land readjustment is a tool that is used and how widely in the US, and for what purposes. You're on mute. Nico, you're on mute.
Land readjustment is not used in the US, but as was mentioned by Umbretta, I think it's used almost everywhere. Certainly in Italy, decades ago, for open land, a proposal was made which was used by some localities of it. 1/3. The 1/3 would be for public facilities, 1/3 for affordable housing, and 1/3 for private development. That's easy to comprehend, but that obviously would work only for new development on open land. With respect to low-income housing, that will come under what in the US we call exactions, developers' obligations in other parts of the world. So exactions can usually have different parts, and the most typical one is development impact fees, DIFs, which can be paid for sewer connections, for water connections, for schools, for parks, and so on. And so that inclusionary housing is one way of applying exactions to a particular development. So it's not part of development impact fees or exactions per se, but it's one aspect of exactions. And one comment I would like to add is that to have cadastral systems in place is a sine qua non of what we were talking about. I did research in Spain about the Barcelona miracle, and the architects, urban planners were being praised for what they had done about the plans, etc. But I interviewed a functionary of the city, and she said, and rightly so, that what made it possible for the city to have many of the revenues utilized to revitalize Barcelona was the reform of the cadastral system from the Franco regime, which almost non-existent and very open to abuses, to when it was reformed under democratic administration. So that is an essential element. And let me finish by saying that it's been fascinating to listen to all the presentations, especially the one about the different ways in which Egypt is trying to receive financing, to develop financing sources many similar to what we're trying to do in the US. I was fascinated by the transaction tax proposal that we're looking at in San Diego as a mechanism to get financing for affordable housing. And I see transaction tax as very much of a mechanism that recapture land value, because it is about transaction real estate. In the US, and especially San Diego, land values have gone up tremendously, and that's one way to recapture land values through a transaction tax. So thank you very much for having me, and it's been fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see we're at time, so Umberto, unfortunately, I'm not going to come back to you, but I do think this is going to be it's a great one for me to come in on, because Nico, apologize in advance, but I'm going to respectfully disagree on your cadastre being a sine qua non for making these things happen. I think for most of the places we live in, a cadastre would be a wonderful thing to have, and but very far from actually being implemented. And that's not that one shouldn't work on the cadastre at the same time, but I think given the how quickly urbanization is happening, given how quickly the housing needs are growing, and therefore, but not being met, and therefore informal settlements growing, we need to think sort of outside the box and be innovative with what we can do. And it means that maybe many of our traditional instruments, or the ways our instruments have traditionally been implemented, is probably be best said, may not work one for one. But I do think that we are seeing some innovative approaches. I think both Samar, with your discussion around the urban expansion areas, Umberto, with your case studies around land readjustment, show how in places where we have extremely poor record keeping, that it's still possible to understand and recapture the value in part, because that's, there is an understanding that this value is being created, and in sort of the words of Adam Smith, Henry George, and others, that this is an unearned increment. But I think in places where that happens, it happens successfully because of, and this is something that we all agree on, community involvement is key, in having all different parts of the community, both from the users, from the owners of the land to the users of the land, to the renters, to some cases even the secondary renters involved, is important, because land value capture is about capturing the public benefit and reinvesting it in the public. So at the very least, no one should be worse off. But in general, we should be unleashing the positive cycle to be able to invest in our future, and importantly, in context of this discussion, for adequate housing. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for Habitat for Humanity Europe and MENA region for hosting. And as Dina said, I don't know, Dina, whether you want to give any final closing remarks, but this is the first in many conversations. As we all know, who were in Beirut, we already are continuing the conversation already now, less than 2 months later. So this is a really hot conversation, hot topic around the world, and it's about us collating our ideas and thinking outside the box to make it happen. So Dina, thank you very much for organizing, and over to you for any closing words.
Thank you so much, Astrid. I think today we sort of scraped the surface of the potential. What I see is a really amazing potential for land value capture to fill that gap that so many governments need in finding sources of revenue to upgrade informal areas, which in most cases, at least this is the case in Egypt, most cases of informal settlements need upgrading interventions. They don't necessitate complete relocation or eviction, and so having such a source of revenue could definitely fill that gap, and has a lot of potential to make an impact in the standards of living of people living in informal settlements. So thank you to the speakers and to the discussant for this really interesting discussion. And as Astrid was saying, stay tuned to our website, as we'll be having more events over the course of the coming months. And I invite you all to register and participate in those events as well. And I hope you enjoyed the discussion today, and see you all in the upcoming events. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Really
Thank
nice
you.
meeting up.
Bye.
Have a good evening.
And
Bye.
thank you.